Hey everyone, this is Argo Visa's Student Visa Week. We are so excited to be doing our second annual Student Visa Week. And I think for most consular officers, and now even us, after we've left the government, for Argo officers, we're always really excited about student visa season. So I have with me guests, Jenna, who is one of our Argo officers, and Krista, who's also one of our Argo officers. And we do a lot of work with student visa applicants. And it's really interesting with student visas because it does tend to be seasonal. I know a lot of you guys have gotten your I-20s and you're getting ready to head off to school this fall. And you're probably just now trying to get your visa appointment and get prepared. In today's session, we're specifically going to be talking about master's students, PhD students, anyone who is pursuing their graduate school programs in the United States. And, hopefully some of the topics that we bring up will be of interest to you, will help you during your visa interview process. A little bit about Argo Visa. We're a company of ex-visa officers. Jenna has worked in Brazil, Krista has worked in Mexico and Guatemala. I've worked in China and Mexico and Hong Kong. So between us, we have just so much experience behind the visa window, having interviewed so many visa applicants just like yourselves. And don't feel like you have to go through this process alone. It can be very nerve-wracking. It can be a short interview, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. In fact, it's really high stakes. And this is the gateway to all of your dreams and all of your goals in the United States. So don't underestimate this very important process in getting your visa. And I think especially this year, given the global pandemic and things, kind of getting better and maybe more visa appointments being available, make sure that if you get that appointment to actually be prepared, because it could be your one shot to get approved. And as some of you probably know, if you get denied a visa, it brings all sorts of complications later on. And so, I'm going to kick off this session by just talking a little bit about, I'd like to hear a little bit from Jenna and Krista. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with student visas and graduate school programs when you were a consular officer? How many student visa applicants did you see where you were working at the US consulate or embassy? And what are some common issues that you used to see with this special group of students?
You want to go ahead, Jenna?
Yes, thanks, Krista. So a lot of the interviews that I did at the window were with F visas, especially this time of year. And I would say a common error is that, especially for master's and postgrad students, you spent so much time preparing your application. You spent so much time getting ready for this program. And finally, your I-20 is issued, and you think that all of this work that you put in and all of your qualifications that you've proven to the university have been conveyed to the visa officer. And truthfully, when you walk up to the window, it's the first time that the visa officer is learning about you, and they really don't know your story. So I think that the common misconception and error that happens is that, especially for master's and postgrad, because it's so hard to get into these programs, to finally have your I-20 issued, and then they don't prepare at all for the interview. So the visa officer, me as a visa officer, I was trying to really pull information out of applicants, trying to understand their financial situation, not knowing that they had already sent all of their financial documents to the university to show that they had the funding. But visa officers don't have access to that. So that's why it's so important that you prepare for the F visa interview, because the visa officer is going to be understanding your situation in that moment. So those 2 minutes or less that you have with them, you need to be prepared for a tough conversation. You need to be prepared to talk about your finances, your plans for after your program. And, it's the last step that you need to make your dream of sitting in the US a reality. It's very important to prepare for it.
I definitely agree with that, Jenna. And I would add that I think that some people go to the F-1 visa interview with the assumption that it's going to be just a rote interview and it's just a very easy administrative step. And, sometimes that can be true, but often it's not. And so anyone listening to this video should definitely be aware of, how to prepare for your F-1 visa interview, how to talk to a visa officer about your studies. One thing that I think that people really assume, especially all the F-1 interviews that I did in Mexico, was that the officer knows why you want to study in the US. And that's not true. A question you will often get is, why do you want to study in the US? And I got answers as varied as, because there are pretty girls on US campuses, to, because my mom studied at a school in the US, or because of a certain program at the university. And so you really want to hone in on being able to answer that question of, like, why the US? There's tons of universities all over the world. And if you don't know how to answer competently and coherently the question of why you want to study in the US, you're not going to have a good F-1 visa interview. And it is not just a, administrative easy step. And if you can't answer questions like that, especially the question of why you want to study in the US, you might come up with some difficulties at your interview.
I think that's such a great point, Krista. And I know in doing Argo consultations, sometimes I stress to clients that question, why are you studying in the US, which tends to be the first question that a student visa applicant will get. That first question by the visa officer sets the tone for the entire interview, right? Would you guys agree that it's really important to be prepared for the first question? And if so, why?
Absolutely. So as soon as you open your mouth to respond to the first question, you're setting the tone for your interview. The officer is going to be judging. Do you seem like a serious student? Do you seem like someone who's done the work, who really is going to succeed at a program in the US? Is your English level on par with the kind of studies that you're going to do in the US? Would you need extra English training or no? According to your I-20, does that seem correct? Do you seem like the kind of person who really is organized and is going to succeed at studying in the US? So the tone, the demeanor, and the content of the response to your first question are absolutely key.
I agree, Krista. I think that what I always tell our clients at Argo as well is the interview is very short and you're asked very few questions in general. So every time you're asked a question, that is an opportunity to explain yourself, to set the tone of the interview, as you said, Krista, and to show who you are, more. It's not really about the documents, it's about the conversation. So especially that first question, you're showing them who you are, you're showing them your academic qualifications because of your English level. There's a lot that you can show when you come up with a really clear, concise, and relevant answer to that first question.
That's so true. And so turning to specifically students who are pursuing graduate school degrees, I think that a common problem that I have seen from student visa applicants who are applying is, it's actually more common, more often than not, that students have already started their education in the US. They've already done their undergraduate studies in the US. Now they're pursuing maybe their first or second master's degree. How do you feel about students who have been in the US for a really long time, and perhaps this is, going on their 6th or 7th year studying in the US, and what would you recommend to those students in preparing for this next visa interview?
I'll start off with this one. I think it's interesting as now as an Argo officer, and being here in the US, it's impressive that you're doing your undergrad and your graduate degree in the US. It's really showing that you're excelling in US academics, and it's impressive. However, I do remember my time as a visa officer when I see someone who's been in the US for 7 years and they want to go back. I have some questions, right? So how are you affording to spend all of this time in the US? Finances becomes a very important question. And, having the applicant in front of me when I was a visa officer at the window, being able to even break down the finances of how they're paying for it, to credibly describe, for example, what their financial sponsor does for a living or their parents, There's the financial question when you've spent that much time in the US. And there's also what's the present intent to depart, right? So in the end, the F visa is a non-immigrant visa. So you should have some sort of future plans of returning to your home country, and you should be able to describe them to the visa officer. So I think that's been interesting, right? It makes sense. It shows that you're academically excelling, the fact that you've been in the US so long studying, but it leads to a lot of questions at the visa interview, and you really need to be prepared to answer them.
So one thing that I would add to that is, while it can show that you're excelling in the US, it can also, and this happened to me in a lot of interviews I had as a consular officer, is, well, are you really doing that well? Why is it taking so long? So questions of, your academic stability will possibly come up, and you definitely at your interview want to be able to credibly explain what kind of program you're in. Why is it taking a little longer? Did you have a child in that time and you needed to take a little break, or you took less credits one semester because of a certain life circumstance that you had? You really need to be able to have a tight argument around why it has taken you longer, especially if you have exceeded the normal time of like what a master's or a PhD would usually take. The other thing is that you should be prepared to definitely explain what your career goals are out of this. Consular officers are not going to be very favorable to eternal students. If it just seems like you have the money and time to study the rest of your life, that might not be, a favorable argument for your visa. And so, do you have career goals attached to this long-term study plan that you have? What kind of salaries do you expect to be able to make after you've finished all of your studies? And so you want to make sure that you're super able to explain kind of the career goals and the life goals attached to an extended period of study.
I love hearing these answers from you guys, because it just reminds me of, even though the interview process, the interview itself is really short, just how substantive and how deep consular officers can get, right? Because they want to make use of those 5 minutes to really understand sort of what makes you tick, what is going on in your life, all of these things that are happening. So I feel like for our students who are thinking that this is a rubber stamp, they're just going to go in, pass over their I-20, not have to say much, get their visas approved, it sounds like for a few minutes at least, they really have to advocate for themselves and defend themselves and their decisions. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely, yeah. So the interviewee, the applicant's job is to make their life choices make sense to the consular officer that they are talking to. And that is a very subjective process, because obviously you're talking to an individual who has their own kind of conceptions about what a student should be, what that person should be studying, how this life plan should work out. And so you want to be really prepared to show yourself as a very competent, coherent, serious person who has goals and who knows what they're doing in their life, to be able to convince that consular officer that this visa makes sense.
Yeah, and something I commonly tell clients as well is, you're taught your whole life to be humble about your achievements, right? But at the visa interview, that's your time to shine, and that's your time to really showcase all of these things that you've done, showcase how you're qualified for the program that you're applying for. It's the time that you need to show the confidence in your ability.
Absolutely. So one other type of client that I've noticed does have issues with their visa applications and their visa interviews. Students who tend to be what consular officers call non-traditional, right? Perhaps, this is a second career and they're going back to school. Perhaps they just look a little bit older than your average, graduate school student in their, mid-20s or late 20s. And so could you tell us a little bit about the consular officer's perceptions of these students and how these students could prepare to put themselves in the best position?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Krista touched on this a little bit. The visa officers are coming to that interview with their own preconceived notions of what a student looks like, right?
Mhm.
So if you're outside of what that pattern of a student would be like, so potentially, if you're a student applying in the US, you're younger in your 20s, your parents have the financial means to pay for your time in the US. And if you're outside of that sort of pattern, then it's really important that you convey your situation and that you make the visa officer understand why you're studying when you are. So there's no problem, that you're a non-traditional student, but you have to make sure that it makes sense for the visa officer. So be prepared to tell your story, be prepared to even get vulnerable. Something that Mandy touched on is that you have a very short amount of time, but during that time, things get real, right? You're going to be vulnerable. You're going to be telling deeper things about yourself that you would normally save for close friendships. But at the visa office, at the visa window, you really need to get that information out there in a credible way, in a concise way. You need to convince the visa officer that indeed you are studying, and it's okay that you're a non-traditional student because your true intent is to study.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well. Sometimes when you're a non-traditional student, you also have like other family members involved in the application. You might have a spouse or children who are going to be accompanying you. And you want to make sure that when you're talking to the visa officer, you're going to be able to speak credibly about what their plans are going to be. So if your spouse is joining you and they are going to take kind of a gap in their employment to support your studies, you really want to be able to talk about like, what are they going to do all day? If their only plan as a 30-plus-year-old professional is to watch TV all day, you're not going to do very well with the consular officer. Are they going to be doing any kind of like online courses back at a university at home, or are they going to continue to travel back and forth while they're on that dependent visa to continue their jobs? Be really prepared and don't think that, just, oh, they're my dependent, so they're going to qualify. You could really put in doubt the consular officer's view of your case as a whole if it doesn't seem like you really have a plan for what your spouse or child will be doing while they're in the United States.
That is such a good point. What do you feel are some common reasons, if there are any, for graduate school students getting denied or perhaps being put into the dreaded administrative processing pile where, there's going to be a delay, there's going to be more time before they can get that visa approved? What are some reasons that you have seen that these types of students get denied their visas?
One thing is, if you have studied in the US previously and you just weren't a great student, there were maybe issues about completing your studies. Maybe if there's like a warning on your case that you have dropped out of school during certain semesters. So you really want to make sure that if you've had any issues in your studies as an undergraduate student or prior any experience in the US prior, have you had a DUI, that kind of stuff. If you have been in the United States and you've had any problems, you want to be super prepared for your visa interview to make sure that you can talk competently about why this program that you're going to go to now is going to be successful and why it makes sense for this time in your life.
Correct. I think that's a major reason for denial, right? Prior, behavior with your F visa in the past. So whether you kept your status active, whether you've always been enrolled, whether you've been doing well in school, whether you abided by all of the rules that, are involved with OPT, for example,
you
need to be prepared to explain any sort of issues that you had in the past, because it really weighs heavily on your future applications. So I think that's a huge part of it. Something I touched on earlier as well, finances, and really being able to explain how you're going to pay for the program and for your time in the US. You may assume that because you were able to pay for your undergrad, that's going to, make it clear that you could pay for your master's degree program. However, master's degrees, PhDs can be, very expensive. Living in the US is also costly. So you need to be able to explain your finances, right? And the other thing is, if you're not able to explain, like what Krista said, how this is going to benefit your career, or explain how, you're going to return to your home country and you're going to have a career in your home country. If you can't talk about that and the visa officer thinks that you don't have any intent to return after this next program, then that is another reason that your visa could be denied.
One thing too, and I saw this a lot as a visa officer in Mexico, was the impression that a consular officer can have through your interview that your F-1 visa is just an excuse to live in the United States, rather than a bona fide course of study that is, going to set you up as a bona fide student. So if you cannot competently talk to the visa officer about, like Jenna said, why you want to do this, how this makes sense for your career, how you're going to apply the knowledge that you hope to gain in the program to your profession, or to your business. If you can't talk about that stuff, you may have some problems in your visa interview. And especially when, like I said earlier, spouses or children are involved, you want to really make sure that the consular officer does not get the impression that you just want to enroll your kids in school in the US. Unfortunately, in Mexico, that was a big thing that consular officers were looking out for. And so, really being able to competently explain your plans prior, during, and after your studies are going to be key to getting that approval.
It's so true.
And,
that's such a good one.
And just to add to that, going back to the question that you mentioned, why do you want to study in the US, or why did you choose this program? That's another example, when the visa officer is trying to understand if they're a credible student that wants to study, or whether they're just trying to live in the US for some other purpose, right? So you want to be careful that you're not giving some sort of boilerplate language response of what you read in the pamphlet, right? You need to really think about why you chose the program that you did, and what your intentions are once you finish that program.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to mention to our audience too is, and if you don't know this already, I think this is a really good time for a reminder that if you do end up getting your visa denied, which we hope that doesn't happen to anybody out there, but if it does stay in your visa record, right? So that's going to have to be addressed at your next visa interview. And one of the things that I have seen is that any complication in your case that takes you out of the group of what we consider ordinary students, as Jenna and Krista and I've discussed, if you have a lot of family in the US, if you're in love with an American citizen, if someone has already filed a green card petition for you, sometimes people don't think about that. If you have had prior refusals, even if they were not for student visas, if they were for tourist visas or some other type of visas, keep in mind that means that you will have a tougher visa interview, regardless of your situation. And at Argo, what we do is we find out everything about your life, not just about your student visa aspirations, but about, your travels and your family and your employment. And then we understand your situation. We give you a strategy. We practice mock interviews with you. We listen to how you answer. We give you feedback. And, John and Krista, you've been working with a lot of our student visa applicants, over the past year. Would you say that an Argo consultation would be helpful for someone who is preparing for their next visa interview?
Absolutely. For all the reasons that we've talked about here, being prepared for your student visa interview is actually an amazing investment in your future, because if you get that, if you do get denied at your visa interview, it can have huge implications for your future plans in the US, for any future applications. And of course, it will, you'll either have to reapply, see if you can get another interview, especially with the scarcity of interviews right now. That may mean that you miss your program and you have to defer. So being prepared for your F-1 interview as a master's student or as a person looking to do a certificate program or an undergraduate program is super important.
Correct. And, just as you've prepared so much for this program, you should be preparing for your visa interview. It's the last step, but the most important step. And at Argo, because we're all ex-visa officers, we know exactly what happens at the visa interview. We know what questions will be asked, and we can prepare you for that. In addition, by doing the mock interviews, you'll get better at responding to the questions, and especially in English, if they're going to be testing your English at the time of the interview. A session with an Argo officer is extremely helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys so much for joining me for this session. You guys can find out more about us at argovisa.com, and we really look forward to helping you get to school this year. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.